let's say that you and I were living in 1948, and the UN decided that they were going to give the state of Utah, Arizona, and Nevada back to the Native Americans because they had the land historically. Mm-hmm. And that they were now going to control things, and we were going to create a new state. And if we wanted to, we could leave. We can go to California. We can go to other states. But we're going to give these states back, and you guys, and you basically have to submit to their rule. And it's the UN who is coming in and dictating this. Now, I think that you and I would be really upset about this.
Sure.
This is our land. We are Americans. Mm-hmm. Our ancestors came out here and built the cities and towns of the Intermountain West. And so I can't help but go, in 1948, I don't know that I would have supported the establishment of the nation of Israel, because I would say those people, the Arabs already live there. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's show. My name is Jacob Hansen. I'm the host of Thoughtful Faith, and joining me today is my friend from Quick Media, Greg Matsen. Greg, how are you?
Doing great. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, well, I really wanted to talk to you. For any of you guys who don't know, Greg has an excellent channel, Quick Media, on YouTube. Greg, actually, real quick, just give everyone a brief summary of what Quick Media is, just in case they've been living under a rock.
We cover mostly cultural issues. We talk about philosophy, history, theology. We do a lot on Latter-day Saint current events and cultural issues. And we've been doing that for about 4 years now, maybe a little more.
You also have like a Come Follow Me series, right? That you guys do.
Yeah, I did a Come Follow Me series. I did that for the full first 4 years, right? We're repeating back with the New Testament now, so I don't do it anymore, but that's all on the channel there as well. So I've done all 4 years with that.
Very cool. Well, obviously, with the recent current events going on with the things in Israel, I figured I might want to talk to somebody who follows current events. And in addition, you have some connections to you've traveled over there or something like that. Help me understand your connection to the Middle East or to the.
There's not much there really. I was in Egypt, and so I wasn't in Israel. I run some tours out there, and I had some that were with me in Egypt were in Israel after our Egyptian trip. I didn't stay around for Israel, but fortunately, it was their travel day out of Israel on October 7th, the day that this all happened. So most of them were already at the airport. Some were not yet, and they had some trouble. They ended up. Some of them just had to find a ticket anywhere, and a lot of them went to Istanbul. A lot of them ended up going to Greece or other places. They just had to get out, any ticket they could find to get out. So, but a lot of them were in the bunker, right there at the airport. There, they've got these bomb shelter bunkers, and so they had to put them down there for several hours, and they weren't sure if they were going to get out. But fortunately, everybody got out.
Good. Well, I know I had somebody online who was mentioned that you were over there recently, and they were kind of like, we haven't heard from Greg in a while. Is he okay? So I texted you the other day. I was kind of like, hey, Greg, everything okay?
Yeah. You know what? I picked up a bug when I was out there the last day. I think I was in Egypt.
Oh,
and
really?
So I ended up, I think it was COVID, and so I've just been a little out of commission since I got back, but alive and kicking now. Ready to roll. Right.
Well, good. I'm glad to get the first chat with you since you've gotten over your illness.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, obviously this, I actually was out of town for this last week, so I haven't really followed things too closely, but I started to as I've gotten back into town, and I've just been in a state of like just sadness, honestly. Outrage, yes, and also, but mostly just like, like this is such a mess. There are just horrific things going on. And I just want to get what is your just kind of initial reaction to the attacks on Israel and all of that? What's kind of your initial reaction to it all?
Horror, honestly. This is, there's two sides of this, obviously, but the attacks that happened on October 7th, in Israel, that is not an act of war, right? That is pure terrorism. Mm-hmm. that happened there, and seeing a number of the images, it was to some degree psychological warfare by Hamas wanting to put these up online, putting them on social media. But it was absolute horror. It was the reports as they kept coming in, and you'd see some, a lot of these videos have been taken down now, but it's absolute horror. And now, of course, there's going to be consequences to this, and there's just going to be a lot more bloodshed. There's going to be a lot more bloodshed than what we've seen already. I think we're somewhere around 3,500 dead now at this point on both sides, and that may rise several times over the next several weeks or months.
Well, and it's funny. So I'm not a current event show per se, although I do touch on current events that are, I think that, thoughtful saints would want to opine about or think about. And this obviously is one that crosses that line, because there's so many, there's moral implications to this. There's religious angles to it. There's historical aspects to it. But just, I think as I've watched others talk about it, there's sort of what happened in the past, week and a half or past week or so. And it was a brutal, evil terrorist attack by Hamas on the Israelis and on innocent people, just mowing them down and doing horrific things. And anyone who makes any sort of moral equivalence to say that this is somehow justified because of past historic wrongs or whatever, I'm sorry. What Hamas did is not justified. Hamas is an evil terrorist organization that needs to be eradicated from the earth. Agreed. And there is no justifying that in any way. And I think that most people, sane people at least, Black Lives Matter Chicago put out a thing. I don't know if people saw it. It was a graphic where they were literally supporting the Hamas terrorists, saying free Palestine, showing the paragliders going in, literally terrorists going to kill children in their beds. That kind of people, that's insane people. But I think a lot of people also, and myself included to some extent, look at this and want to understand, like, what in the heck is going on here? Like, you start to ask, like, why are people doing this? What is their motivation? Now, I don't care what your motivation is. There's no motivation that justifies what a person has done, but rather than even try and justify it, I do think that there is something to be said for how to understand what has happened. And I'm curious to get your thoughts as to, some of the attitudes that you're seeing about all these things that have happened.
Yeah. So, as far as the attitudes in response to what's going on with this, I'm going to go to one of my pet topics on this, and I'm going to put it under that umbrella because I believe that this has a lot to do with it, and that's critical theory. And when you look at why would Black Lives Matter, as you said, put up this graphic? What does Black Lives Matter have to do with this, and why would they side with the Palestinians on this and support such a thing? The answer is critical theory, because they're critical theorists, and the underlying philosophy and mentality, ideology is very similar. It's pretty much almost mapped on exact to what Hamas teaches. And I don't mean from a religious standpoint, right? Because Black Lives Matter are atheists primarily that have founded that. But they have an ideological overlapping of critical theory that says that they've pinned the Jewish state of Israel as the oppressor. They have said that the Palestinians are the victims. You will see others that would follow along the similar thinking of Black Lives Matter. For example, the student groups at Harvard that are yelling white supremacy and saying basically, okay, so the Jews are white or whiter, and therefore they are the bad guys. They are the oppressors. and you see these weird titles like this, or chants that they go over, crying white supremacy over this. They're mapping it onto their own world here in the United States with critical theory. The problem with that is that the Jews are primarily, over the centuries and the millennia, there is no group that has been more marginalized than the Jews. and if there's any victim group, it is the Jews. And so it's an odd thing to look at. It's these reactions that come up are especially in the United States and in the West, that are of non-Muslim, non-Arab backgrounds, and are mostly institutional and universities, etc. That media, it's law, etc. They're mapping on critical theory onto the situation, and that's why you see this massive support in a lot of the universities for Palestine. They will look at victim and oppressor, and they've already decided who is who, and they're going to map it onto their own world. Mm-hmm. And it's they're in critical theory, the practice of using critical theory on things, the ends always justify the means. Mm-hmm. And so regardless of what has happened and the absolute horror of decapitating babies and raping women and dragging bodies through the streets and putting death and horror up on social media, it doesn't matter, right? It's always the ends justify the means. And we are going, if we can frame the oppressors as who they're supposed to be, the worst of all humankind, then everything is justified. And so that's what I see as the attitude in response to these things. And we're going to see, Jacob, you're going to see, regardless of the reaction of the United States right now, and to some degree the media starting off here, it's going to turn, right? It's going to turn soon. And you're going to have the media, the American media and the Western media, and a number of the governments in the West are going to turn on Israel. Because it's always the same thing. This will always happen this way. And where we're going to enter now into what looks like a ground war, Navy, ground, air, that's going to be happening in northern Gaza. It's going to get bloody, and there's going to be death, and there's going to be bad stories and bad things happening, as in any war like that, and in hand-to-hand combat is going to happen. And that narrative is going to turn very quickly.
I've been, I think that's an interesting point you bring up about the critical theory stuff, because within critical theory is the sort of post-colonial theory, which very much views any sort of pushback against any sort of a colonial power as ultimately justified, and even to extreme lengths. Like, one of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize is within sort of critical theory doctrine is the revolutionary impulse, not the peaceful revolutionary, the blood in the streets revolutionary. Marxist revolution is not a peaceful protest. It is blood in the streets protest. It is violent when you get down to kind of the real hardcore ideology. And that's why I think, like you're saying, to what degree people are that way in the United States, and the numbers of them, I think, is a topic to discuss. But obviously those types of people are out there and do exist, especially within universities. Now, I want to take another angle and say, I also see a reaction from people like Ben Shapiro. Now, what's funny is this: I'm a big Ben Shapiro listener. If I were to pick someone politically that I tend to, generally I'm on the same page with, Ben Shapiro's generally there. I think he has a very balanced analysis a lot of the times. But what's funny, and Dennis Prager's another person. Now, both of these are very ardent Jews. And I respect that. And I actually really am glad that Ben Shapiro is so strong in his religious beliefs. I think he's a great proponent of religion. But I will say that I see a bias come out in their, emotional response to some of these things because they are so close to it. And because they are so closely tied in their identity to the land of Israel being a Jewish state, that they, and so I'm not saying that they're in any way equal to the other side that you're talking about. Okay. Not at all. But I'm just saying that I've seen things from even reputable people that I listen to, like Ben Shapiro, push information that I later found out is false on this matter. Right. And there's been a lot of sort of fog of war in this whole thing that's been going on, I think. So it's hard to get down to it. But I guess another question I would ask to you is, why does any of this matter to a Latter-day Saint? Like, is there any special significance to us as Latter-day Saints, or any reason that, why are Latter-day Saint channels like ours talking about what's going on in far off lands? And, all right, so, maybe there was some conflict in some country in Africa and a bunch of people got killed. We won't talk about that. Like, why is Israel and this conflict with the Palestinians, why does it matter to Latter-day Saints, or does it?
Yeah, I don't know that it does more than anybody else. I guess that the only thing I can think of is if we're looking at, kind of a signs of the times thing, right? Where we're trying to track and read the tea leaves, so to speak, the fig leaves. And we should do that. And we should look at this conflict and this problem. This is not something that is going to go away. It is something that is going to go right to the very end, this conflict in Israel. Now, I don't think we're, as some might say, we're a year away, 5 years away, 10 years away from the second coming of Christ. I see these people online say these things. I'm like, slow down here, slow down. Yeah. You weren't around maybe during the Yom Kippur War. You weren't around on the 3-Day War. This is
or
not
every other war in human history that people thought, exactly. This is it. This is the end.
Yeah. It's like, just learn from it, learn from what's going on, see what the patterns are, and understand morality here. And this is what I think that we ought to try and learn. There are moral issues on both sides, but I think being able to walk the edge of the sword here and understand the morality on both of these sides is an important thing for us in understanding ourselves and understanding our relationship, because there is a relationship with the old Jerusalem and the new Jerusalem, so to speak, and where things will be going in the future and what we're teaching our kids so I think trying to find that morality is key in a situation like this.
And I think also it's important, and this is something I wanted to take a moment. I actually want to kind of get your thoughts as I go through this, and if I'm framing sort of the history behind some of this as I understand it, if you understand it in the same way. Because what Hamas has done, Hamas is a particular terrorist group that I didn't realize until recently, they kind of control the government in Gaza, but they're not even the majority in Gaza. If I'm not mistaken, that there is actually a way where a smaller group can still control the government within Gaza. And I'm not sure on all that, but that's kind of what I've heard. And so you have a lot of people here who aren't associated with this terrorist organization that are in Gaza where the bombs are dropping right now. Now, I also have an issue where it's like, I think that the people in Palestine should be fighting against Hamas as soon as they saw what Hamas was doing, right? I think to some extent, you can't allow people within your borders to go out and do horrible things to others, and you don't go out and try and go after those people that are doing those horrible things or turn them in or whatever. There should be a revolt against Hamas from within the Palestinian community, right? But I just wanted to separate sort of Hamas and then there's another interesting fact I didn't know until recently. I didn't realize that in the land of sort of Israel, Palestine, there are almost as many Palestinians as there are Jews. I think it's something like 6 million or 5 or 6 million Palestinians, and then 7 million Jews, I think, somewhere in that range.
Where's this?
In the greater Israel Palestine area, West Bank, Gaza, and then all of
I think that number sounds a little high to me. I'm not 100% sure. I thought the number was about 20% of the population.
I think that within the borders of actual Israel itself, not including Gaza and the West Bank, I think it's 20%.
Okay.
If I'm not mistaken. But I think if you take it all, I mean, this is a large, division between these two groups. And essentially, I wanted to throw up kind of a timeline on here. So this is something that a lot of people just don't know is, some people are under the impression like the state of Israel has been this continuous thing that's been on the earth since King David. And it's like, no. In fact, if you just read the Old Testament, the kingdom of Israel falls. And then after that, you have the life of Jesus Christ and all of that happens. And we all kind of know the story of the New Testament, but then the New Testament ends, but we don't know what actually happens kind of after that. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in 70 AD, Jerusalem is destroyed by the Romans. Okay. It's sacked by Rome. And for the next, I don't know, I think it was like 50-year, 80-year period, the Jews are essentially expelled from Israel. It's like, I didn't realize this, but like, it's kind of crazy that once the Temple of Jerusalem fell, like shortly after Jesus Christ, like the whole Jewish sort of project sort of fell apart entirely, right? Like they picked a fight with the Romans. And I have some advice for you historically. If you are a small nation, do not go toe-to-toe with the Roman Empire in a sword battle.
Well, and again, there's a parallel there, right? Because you look at someone like Barabbas, who's on the cross opposite Jesus, or would have been on the cross in place of Jesus. He's a zealot, and he is fighting the Romans because they have occupied or are, have taken over Jerusalem. And it was Antioch before that. That area has almost always been a vassal state. Even during the most of the history of the Jewish people, it was a vassal state.
And the Jewish people, though, as a vassal state, though, still maintained their own sort of identity. What I didn't realize, and the reason I put the little nuclear bomb here at 70 AD was because that was sort of the end of it. It was like after that, they were scattered. And then by the 300s, the Christians actually came to be a larger group in Jerusalem and in Israel than were the Jews. And so you enter this Christian period from about roughly 300 to about 635. And in 635, this is when the new guys in town, the Muslim empires, are on the warpath, and they conquer Jerusalem and the land of Israel, Palestine. And then this is what's wild. From 600 until 1917, you have a period where essentially, and there's different Arabic kind of caliphates and things that controlled it, but roughly speaking, the Arabs controlled Israel, Palestine. And there were people that were living in this land. I mean, that's just for context. That's 5 to 6 times the length that the United States has existed. Okay. Now, they never established an official, let's call it a Palestinian state. But regardless, the people who lived in that region identified with that region. It's kind of like in the United States, if you live in a particular part of the United States, there are ethnic identities that begin to arise within that. And within that group, you could say that what arose were the Palestinian people. These were the Arabs who were Muslim and who lived in that region. And they lived there for, like I said, over the past 1,000 years. And then in 1917, the Ottoman Empire, the Arab Empire, decides to go out and say, hey, well, we're going to go fight with the Western powers. And they lost. And so then in 1917, the British take it over. And during the period of the early 20th century, you had the Zionist movement that was being created, which were basically expelled Jews saying, hey, the Arabs just got kicked out. And this was kind of before that, but they were kind of like, hey, there's a movement to, why don't we get a homeland back? Like, why don't we go back and get this, reclaim our land that we historically had? Now, granted, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, but that was what the Zionist movement was about. And the British were kind of like, and after World War I, well, first World War I, people started moving in there. The Jews did. What was interesting, I didn't realize that the British eventually were like, hey, there's too many Jews coming in here. You guys are making the Arabs angry. And then they were like, knock it off. We're going to stop immigration of Jews to Israel. And then the Israelites actually attacked the British, or the Jews did, which a lot of people don't know. And then the Palestinians, or anyway, and then after World War II, World War II happens. And we all know that World War II was kind of rough on the Jews, and the whole world is going, oh my gosh, like this horrible thing happened to the Jewish people. And the British are like, we're trying to create a homeland for these people. And they eventually turn it over to the UN in 1947. And they basically decide to divide the land up in 1947, and a war breaks out because the Arabs are like, no, we don't want this is our land. We've been here for, however many thousand years. You're not just creating a state in the middle of our land as Palestinian Arabs. And they fought with each other. And 1948, the Jewish state wins that war. They declare their independence. And that is essentially when the Jewish state begins in 1948. But that period since 1948 till today has resulted in conflict after conflict between the Palestinian Arabs, who had maintained that land for super long, to the Jews, who now, through the means of the British and the UN, now are establishing a state on what they consider to be their territory because they've been there for super long time. And so I think the proper way to frame this, the whole conflict, is, and while there are religious undertones, obviously, to every conflict, especially this one, there is a sense in which this is two national groups, two national identities. And even secular Jews have this nationalistic fervor. And they are competing, and they have rival claims to the land, where the Palestinians are like, this is our land. This is Palestine. And the Jews are like, no, this is Israel. And so they've been fighting amongst each other. And what we have just recently witnessed is the most recent reaction of Arab Palestinians to what they perceive as the Jews invading their land. And that's the way I think that they would frame it, right? And obviously what they have done is an act of horrible, evil terrorism. And so I don't know. I wanted to just kind of throw that all out there as I look at sort of trying to frame this. Now, what am I getting right? What am I getting wrong? Anything you'd push back on that?
Well, I think you're right in saying that there are claims for both sides on the land. I don't think there's any question about that. You can go back and say, well, Israel was there before that period of time, and that's their people, and those are the Jews, and they had their temple, and their whole religion and their legacy is built on that land, and they have a covenant with that land, so to speak. But the Muslims feel the same way, right? That whole area there, including the land of Israel, is the land of a covenant, so to speak, something similar to that with the Muslims. And so it's a very touchy thing. The question is do we believe that Israel has the right to exist today at this point? Do they have a claim on the land? Do they have a right to support themselves and to live in that area? And I would say yes. I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, when they went in and Britain went in and during after World War II and the state of Israel was created, they created Jordan at the same time. They tried to create another state where there would be areas where the Arabs could live and have a new state at that time. That was Jordan. Mm-hmm. And so it was already kind of created into a two-state solution. And the other thing I would add is I don't believe for a second that Hamas's attack has to do with just a claim on the land. I would agree with that, by the way. Go ahead. I don't think that is the beginning of it, but that you have to look at them as an ISIS, right? It's the same idea. They want they believe in the same ideology, the extremist ideology that the entire world needs to be converted by the sword if necessary, by bomb, by whatever, by terror, and must all be converted to Islam. That is their belief. And that is what they teach everyone. And that is what their ideology is. And so for them, going and doing this it's not just we hate Jews and we want to, we're the victims of these oppressors. That's their charter itself says that they want to eliminate all Jews and eliminate the state of Israel.
Yeah.
And if you follow Hamas at all in a number of their teachings and what they've taught previously, they want the entire world to be Islamic.
I think the way I would frame it, and I think you're right, is that when you have a conflict like the general, let's call it, Palestinian-Israeli conflict over the land and the claims to it, that terrorists will take advantage of that situation and will radicalize people within those ranks to basically help them do absolute horrific evil in the name of false Islamic ideology, right? And this convert by the sword and the ISIS kind of ideology, right? And so I think what I have found is that I believe that we can get essentially from any sane person condemnation of ISIS and of Hamas, and I believe of Hezbollah and all of these groups who are terrorist organizations. Okay. You cannot, if you are killing innocent civilian people, like it is like, I'm sorry, I have zero tolerance for it. Like, I don't care. You can't justify it. Now, if I were to circle back though, to look at the general Palestinian conflict that has been going on, it does come down to what you said. And this is the tough question. Okay. You say, does Israel have, and I don't like to say even this, maybe you could say it as the right to exist, but do the Israelis have a claim to that land that is greater than that of the Palestinians? Now, here's an interesting analogy that I like to think of. Okay. Let's say that you and I were living in 1948 and the UN decided that they were going to give the state of Utah, Arizona, and Nevada back to the Native Americans because they had the land historically, and that they were now going to control things, and we were going to create a new state. And if we wanted to, we could leave. We can go to California. We can go to other states, but we're going to give these states back, and you guys, and you basically have to submit to their rule. And it's the UN who is coming in and dictating this. Now, I think that you and I would be really upset about this.
Sure.
This is our land. We are Americans. Our ancestors came out here and built the cities and towns of the Intermountain West. And so I can't help but go, in 1948, I don't know that I would have supported the establishment of the nation of Israel, because I would say those people, the Arabs already live there. You can't go into their land and just set up something new there, right? Now, granted, I knew that there were a lot. I mean, the bigger issue for me is that this outside entity is coming into these people and saying, hey, we're creating this thing. And I don't know, that has always rubbed me the wrong way. Do you see it differently?
I think it's nuanced. Do I see it very differently? I don't know that I do. Now, would I, in your example of the Intermountain West, are we going to go out and launch rockets at the Native Americans? Are we going to, decapitate their babies and commit these horrific things? Or are we going to get on with our lives and focus on our families and still living wherever else, California or Montana, and still live our lives as Americans? And that's not what's happening there, right? That is not what's happening. And it's not because of the land. It's just not. It's not that that's not an issue. It is an issue, but it is secondary. The issue is an extreme ideology that they want to exterminate the Jews. I've seen this on campuses over the years, where you have supportive Palestinians on university campuses that are saying, yes, regardless of where any of them are in the world, we need to exterminate them. We need to get rid of them.
No, and
it's an ideology that is taught, and that there needs to be a force of religion, the religion of Islam, pushed throughout the entire world. That is what they believe. Now, when you have that, I don't care where you live. It doesn't matter where you live. That when you have that, it does matter where you live. If that's your neighbor, if that's what all Canadians believed, and they needed to destroy all Americans and eliminate all Americans, we are. There's going to. That they live under that constantly. It's not a matter of just the land. Let's dispute the land. I believe that if the people of Palestine really wanted for example, a two-state solution, another one. They already had one in World War II. But if there was another one, I think Israel would do it. I do. I think that they would do it. Now that doesn't mean that the Palestinians are going to get all the land back. But there could be peace. What else are you going to do? When you're looking from a Hamas standpoint, here's what you're saying. You're saying we either move on and live our lives, which we could do happily, either here or in Egypt or in Jordan, regardless, or let's kill all the Jews.
Yeah.
That is their two options.
You're right. And when it comes to Hamas and that ideology, I'm with you 100%. Now I'm going to flip this around though, because this is where it gets really complicated. In 1948, I would have been against the establishment of the state of Israel. But in 2023, that ship has already sailed, because you could flip this around the exact opposite. You could then say that it would be like you and I being, or that the Jews are like the Native Americans. They're there. They've been there since the 1940s and earlier, even when they kind of started migrating there. And now all of a sudden you have, what are you going to do with those 7 million Jews in Israel? Like, we aren't at the beginning of this, you guys. We're 70 plus years in. And at this point, here's the fact. The fact is that the state of Israel was created. Israel went and kicked the crap and conquered essentially all of the people in that area that fought against them. They took over all the territory. They've made concessions to give it back, but Israel has taken the land. And they're there. And there's 7 million of them. And now we have to deal with the reality. The reality is we have 7 million people. And then I think, and if my estimates are right, and they could be wrong, everyone check this, but let's say somewhere around 5-6 million Palestinians in that area. And they all want that land for their group. And they're there together. And so now we're stuck in a hole. And if the Palestinians are going to say, and they're going to allow and tolerate groups like Hamas to exist in their ranks, who want to exterminate the Jews and destroy Israel entirely, like, I'm sorry, that's not a solution we can do at this point in the road. Like, we can look at that.
I think that's exactly right. You're talking about practicality.
Yes.
Right. You're talking about a practical, what do we do now? Where are we at now? And again, do we kill all of the Jews or do we move on and do the best that we can with our own lives? Because again, going back to critical theory, there's a certain allure to being a victim and to creating a culture of hatred, right? Because it pushes the responsibility off of yourself. And that is what Hamas is trying to do. That's what ISIS does. They want to kick the hornet's nest as much as they possibly can so that they can push for war, so that they can push for conflict. That's what they live for. That's what the ideology is. I mean, the reason they're doing this right now, Hamas is doing this right now, is because Saudi Arabia is about to sign the Abrahamic Accords with with Israel. So Iran, who is really pushing a lot of the buttons on this, regardless of their denial, that's the last thing. They don't want peace. They don't want the peace. They can't have the peace because it destroys their ideology. It destroys their purpose for ruling.
Yeah.
And so when it deflates their power, because that's their message. It's a message of hate. It's a message of conflict. And if there's more, I mean, if Saudi Arabia signs that, right, you've already got a couple of the nations that have signed this, but if you've got Saudi Arabia that comes in and signs this, and all reports were that they were going to do it, and maybe they still will down the road, it changes the dynamic in the Middle East completely. And it throws people like Hamas out of power. They lose power from this. Iran loses power from this. And you also have, by the way, those are Sunni nations. Right? Now Hamas is Sunni, but they're funded by Iran. And which is not Sunni, right? And so they fund Hamas, but they fund Hezbollah, and they don't want the Sunni nations to be in that position and to have that kind of additional power. I mean, Egypt is already, to some degree, one of the biggest allies of Israel because of their trade and because of. I was just there. I was talking to a number of Israelis. I mean, it's not like they're in love with Israel, but a lot of their increase in economy recently is because of commerce and trade and agreements that they have with Israel. Well, and that they're a Sunni nation, right? And so Iran is not going to allow these things to happen. They can't. They're going to lose their power base.
Well, and as I look at it, from that practical perspective, I think that those advances in trade and all that kind of stuff like that, that's the way out of this. You know, if we're going to do it, it's going to take time. It's going to be hard. But if you have these two groups that are in this land and we have to figure out a way to make them live together now that they're there, you do have to start getting practical about it. And the reality is that Hamas and the Palestinians are putting down a very hard line. Now, granted, I think that there can be a discussion about, has Israel done all that they can on their end? I think that's a whole nother debate to have. But the reality is that you have to frame and understand what's going on. You just have two different groups of people put into the same box together, millions of them, who you have to figure out, okay, how are you guys all going to get along and make this work? And what's really scary to me, this is what's terrifying to me. Conquest historically has gone in one of two ways. One of the ways that you go in, you conquer, and you basically set up a puppet government and you run some other government like the Romans did in Israel, where they're kind of like, look, all you leaders, you're all loyal to Rome, pay your taxes, but we'll basically let you guys do your thing. And that's, we just want your money and send us soldiers and resources and stuff. And that's it, right? That's kind of the Roman way. But there's other ways of doing conquest. And that's it. You go in and you kill every single person that's your enemy, man, woman, and child. You clear the land. You might even call this the Old Testament style of doing it. You go in and you clear the land out of everyone in there, so that way they won't cause you problems anymore. And the problem is that the route we're going to go? Are we going to go the old school route of conflict, of conquest, where the only solution is that either Israel wipes out the Palestinians or the Palestinians wipe out the Jews? Now, nobody in the West wants that, and I don't think most people, any sane person, wants that. But then if that isn't the case, if it's not either wipe out one side or the other so the whole problem goes away because one side doesn't exist anymore and you do a proper conquest, as it were, or what you do is you negotiate a settlement between the groups. And I think the Abraham Accords and stuff, and I think you're exactly right. I think Iran is terrified because Iran sees an alliance happening between a lot of people don't know this, just for context. Iran and Saudi Arabia are kind of the two big players so far as I can tell. And there may be others, but two of the main players in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they both are kind of vying for the dominance over the Middle East generally.
That's
like
correct.
Who's the big dog in town? Okay. They're caught in
different factions of Islam. People need to understand that, right? Iran is Shia and Saudi Arabia is Sunni. And so it's kind of like Catholics and Protestants, right? They're all Christians, but there is a divide there of some belief, but certainly of history and legacy and a people. They admire different prophets and leaders in their theology. And so there is a conflict there.
And then there's all the conflicts within intertribal groups within the Arabic world. Like the Arabic world is a big, complicated mess of relationships. Tribal. Okay. And obviously you're talking about the Sunni Shia divide is one of the primary ones, but the national divide between sort of those who are loyal to Saudi Arabia and that kind of alliance, and then the Iran alliance, if Saudi Arabia ends up becoming friends with Israel and all the nations around, and that whole sort of conflict clears up, that's keeping those nations around Israel all occupied, that consolidates the power for Saudi Arabia on that side of the Arabic world. And then Iran is then now in a weaker position than before. And it is very likely that Saudi Arabia will become the global player. And so to foment problems, Iran and its evil ideology and all of its groups are doing their best to destabilize any peace in the Middle East for power purposes.
And you need to think about that, right? That's what's behind this. It is against peace, right? It is, and that's why you see all of this violence. I mean, they're trying to erupt something much larger, I believe, than what's happening here so far. Why would you not want to cover those things up? They want the whole world to see what's going on here because they want to initiate a much larger conflict than what we have so far.
So let me real quickly kind of push back a little bit on that. Because I do believe that there are external forces outside of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that have an interest in what's going on. And obviously Iran, I would say, is front and center in that. I think that they're the ones that are fomenting it. They want it to be as bad as possible. Okay. I'm not aware of what the prevailing Palestinian attitude is towards groups like Hamas. But frankly, the fact that they would tolerate it at all is a big negative in their direction. But this is another thing. I don't know a lot about this. And I'm kind of ignorant to it. Some people say, oh, it's all lies, and other people, and I'm kind of like, I don't know. I haven't investigated enough. And that is the treatment of the Palestinians within Israel. Because the reality is that the Israel is more powerful than the Palestinians. Okay. They are militarily, culturally, like they are supported by Western powers. Like they are a powerful group. In fact, very powerful to the point that I'm kind of people are very impressed by the IDF military, all that kind of stuff, their capabilities. They are a top-notch military organization. And so you have a lot of the Palestinians who are from a culture that I just generally look at as a poorer culture in its ability to produce high levels of sophisticated military things, all that kind of stuff. Okay. That's just my take. And so I do wonder, because obviously there's a lot of bad blood between these two groups. I wonder how much the Israelis have done things that we would look at and say, that's not fair. That's kind of rough, or you guys are kind of taking it out on them hard, or have they done things that are wrong? Now, again, none of this is to justify what Hamas has done. Okay. It's just my whole thing is to try and get as accurate a perspective as I can, because like, let's go back to that example of the Intermountain West. Okay. if you and I wanted to try and get back our land, obviously, if you and I went, or we were opposed to this UN imposition into the Intermountain West to give the land back to the Native Americans, if you and I went out and started murdering a bunch of, Native Americans in their homes and stuff like that, like obviously, like that's like we're monsters. Like you don't do that. But you do have to say, okay, well then there's a difference between, are the means that they're using to accomplish their goal wrong? Yes, we can say that. But is the goal itself then therefore wrong? Right? Like, what is there a viable goal that the Palestinians are putting forward to deal with the problem of all of these people occupying land that's extremely important to them, that they both want to rule over and be the dominant power over?
No.
I don't know. I say more like I haven't seen, and that's why I tend to say to people, I do stand with Israel, but I don't stand within Israel blindly. I stand with Israel primarily for practical reasons. Now that we're 70 years into this, because I think Israel is actually making a good faith effort to try and figure this mess out. And, but I empathize to some extent with people that are saying, look, we've been here for thousands of years. Why are these people in our land in the first place?
And again, it's not like they're just all of a sudden some transplant. These are people that were in that land for thousands of years, for roughly 1,500 years. So it's not just anybody, right, that's in that place. There is some claim, so to speak. They have heritage. They have their scriptures all happen there. They have a lot of heritage to the place.
But
the issue is like what you said. What is the practical solution? What do you do
Native Americans in the Intermountain West? Couldn't you say that same thing about Native Americans?
Sure, you could. But what's the practical solution to this?
And that's what I
right. You know what? Again, I mean, it's there is no two-state solution that is being pursued by the Palestinians. They'll talk about it every once in a while. You used to have Yasser Arafat, and that would be brought up all the time, and the PLO, and it was never a goal. They always pulled back from any type of peace agreement. And the reason is because they don't want it. They don't want any other type of a practical solution. If Israel today gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian people, if we're going to call them that, it just said, okay, here you go. It's all yours, which they've done in many ways already, granted with restrictions and with blockades, and they still control all the utilities and everything else. But Hamas runs the Gaza Strip 100%. They run everything.
But couldn't you say, I mean, again, to go back to that example, okay, so you guys can have Sanpete Valley or St. George. We'll keep Salt Lake City and Provo, and that's where the Native Americans are going to get, and you guys get the other side. Like, is there a case to be made that they have something to say? We're like, no, you're not getting any of it. This is our land. We're not letting the UN and other Western powers come in here and kick us out and give this land to other people just because they happen to live here a long time ago. I'm conflicted on that.
No, I agree that it's a valid argument, but it's not practical.
Yeah.
You have to live in reality, right? And live in reality. And again, when you're faced with a decision of, do we move on or do we wipe out the Jews?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be that tough of a decision.
Yeah.
At that point, right? Your morality, the stretching of your morality to get to the point of saying we're going to kill 7 million people and then move beyond that and go to the world after that, right? It's disgusting. It's disgusting. And that is the practicality of the situation right now. You can't do that.
Yeah.
Look, you've got shared religion, heritage, tradition, people throughout the rest of the entire Middle East. It's not like you're all of a sudden this little tiny Gaza Strip sitting all by yourself in the Middle East in that region, and you're the only ones there with that tradition and everything else. That's what Israel is, right? You've got Al Jazeera, you've got all, the media, everything is all Middle East based and Arabic and Farsi and Muslim based. It's not like your culture.
You're surrounding. You have 5
your culture
million,
is everywhere.
The reality is that the Jewish people are in the midst of billions of Muslims. You know what I mean? Like, you're talking about like 1 billion people or something like that. I don't know if it's quite that many, but around them, and they're a group of 7 million people. Now, there are those who I think there's sort of an argument to say the U.S. to go out of its way to support 7 million people and then in turn make really angry 1 billion people from a moral standpoint, where we might have a particular moral view that says that that's justified, but from a purely pragmatic political perspective, I would look at that and go, hold on here a second. I have 1 billion people who have the world's oil resources, and then I have a group of 7 million people who give us what exactly? Like, what is the American interest in this beyond the moral interest? Now, I grant the moral interest.
I don't care what it is. The moral interest is the most important interest.
Okay, and I would agree. But it
is the most important. I mean, you can make a parallel to that, and you say the Germans and the 6 million Holocaust, victims. It's almost the same number, right? Yeah. They killed 6 million Jews. And what do you do? Oh, well, I mean, there's a lot more Germans and a lot more of the German people everywhere. So politically, this isn't the smartest thing to do.
Thank the good Lord in heaven that we live in a Judeo-Christian culture that cares about people who we consider our brothers and sisters simply because they are a human being. Because from a purely pragmatic sort of atheistic perspective, if I were to put that hat on, I would legitimately go, I'd be with Nietzsche. I'd say, well, that's not my problem. Let them go. I'm going to side with the side that helps me achieve my goals to have, the ideology that I have advance and my people. And I don't care. Like, if Israel was wiped off the face of the earth, for most people, there would be, besides the moral implication from a actual like financial, economic, all that kind of stuff in the United States, it probably wouldn't make that big of a difference. But we have moral consciences.
The difference that it would make, and just like it did in World War II, the difference that it makes is it takes all of humanity and it drops it down several levels for all of us. Right? Yeah, we all look at that and say, that was done by human beings. The Holocaust was done by human beings. The killing of 100 million people through starvation and other means, through Maoist actions and the Soviet Union, that was done by human beings. And it takes all of us. There is a moral issue here and why is it moral and why do we get involved? Because we're all humanity. We're all brothers and sisters.
See, but that I would, if I were an atheist, I would reject that on Nietzschean grounds.
But
I'd say that's your Christian slave morality speaking, because ultimately, I'm just an animal like any other animal, and if it's to my advantage, I take advantage of it. And why should I stick my neck out for some small group that's being oppressed? Like the oppressed and oppressor narrative from a Nietzschean perspective, you'd look at and say, yeah, duh. The oppressor is the winner. He's the good guy. Yeah. Like, you want to be the oppressor because otherwise you're going to get oppressed. Don't join the loser slave morality of the Christians and adopt. But I'm just making this point because you brought it up. We have this conception of universal humanity and dignity that things like World War II brought out that made us recognize on some spiritual level a revelation was given to our hearts and souls when we saw what happened to say, these are children of God. Now, people wouldn't use that language necessarily, but the Spirit was telling that to people, and they felt it so deep in their souls that it shook them to the core.
And, right? And they created a state.
You're right. Now, I think there's some arguments can be made about, all right, there's a tough situation here when you're looking at, this is what I think is one of the toughest philosophical questions I have ever come across. And that is, what determines the legitimate ownership of land?
Practically speaking, war.
Yes. And that's what's awful. If you're a Christian, you're going, wait a minute. Basically, nations are established because guys with guns go and they draw some borders on a map and say, hey, in this area, you do what we say because we have the guns. And then as soon as another group comes over with more guns, they take the land and then they say, you're going to listen to us because we have even more guns. And as a Christian, you're looking at that going, that's really awful. Like, that's the nature of our world. A bunch of lines with borders with guys with guns defending them. And that's the practical situation in a fallen world. But to some extent, it's like, I don't like to go and take a bunch of guys with guns and tell people, hey, you now have to follow these other guys' orders. That just does not feel Christian. Mm-hmm. And that, to some extent, is the great philosophical sort of quandary, at least that I find myself in trying to answer the question, okay, who has the morally legitimate claim to rule that land? Is it right? Just because the UN came in with all the guns in the world and said, this is what we're doing, folks, we're dividing this up. Is that morally legitimate? Is that the way it's going to be? Imposition by force? And I'm asking questions. I'm not even saying I have the answers because these are really hard questions to answer.
I don't have the answer to that. The other thing I think about is Zion, right? Zion's got to be a place. And you've got this idea of the promised land and where you're going to, and you've got, again, the New Jerusalem and the Old Jerusalem. This is scriptural, right? Where there's going to be lands where Israel gathers to, which is happening, right? I mean, you've got about 15, 16 million Jews in the world. 7 million of them are already in Israel.
Yeah.
Right. You got almost half of all Jews worldwide are now living in Israel.
Well,
and of course, you've got the melting pot of the United States here, which we would call, somewhere here, or all of it. I don't know. You call it the New Jerusalem, but it's like you have to gather somewhere. You're going to be gathering somewhere, and if that's the case,
does gathering imply that we're going to rule it? I mean, here's another question that I've dealt with. Has God entitled a particular race of people to rule that land based on their birthright? Does God grant land based on your race?
No, I don't think so.
I don't either.
Well, let me back up on that. I would say
one, because if it's like, this is the land for the descendants of Abraham.
In Zion, in Jerusalem, he did, right? If we're going to follow the Bible, yes, he did. He gave the promised land to those that would follow the line of, it's not just Abraham, right? For us, looking at it, it would be Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is Israel. Uh-huh. And that they would inhabit the promised land, and they do, right? And so when we look at it, even as Christians, we have to realize that, right? That is.
See, I don't know though. I'm a little bit like, and I'll be honest, this is an area of ignorance, and maybe I'm totally wrong on this, but I look at the New Testament's reconceptualization of Israel as the covenant people rather than as the people of a particular bloodline. And I do wonder how much of bloodline matters at all anymore with Christ. And if the bloodline ideas, that sort of thing has been done away with in some way. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm speaking pure blasphemy and someone can rip me apart on that. But I can't help but be uncomfortable with the idea that there are certain racial groups that are entitled to rule over certain areas of the world just by dint of their blood.
Why?
Because I believe that God is no respecter of persons.
But maybe he's a respecter of land.
Maybe. And I don't know.
I don't think he's a respecter of persons either, but I also believe that in and this applies to anything. It's not just the gospel, right? It's you have to have a group of people, probably a tribe that has familial ties, strong familial ties, that is going to start everything out. And if you don't have that, it never is going to make it. It'll never make it. And so I think that, and it's always that way. It's always a small minority. I mean, look at the church today. We're what are we at? 16, 17 million now. Mm-hmm. It's always going to be a small group that is working to, because if you don't have that, then you have no participants. In other words, you have a small group of people that have to do all the work, that have to try and spread the gospel, that have to try and change the world, that have to live Christian principles and try and spread that. That's the way it always is. And you can bring that all the way down to an individual, Abraham, Enoch, right? It's always that way. What was the land of Enoch? Was that a tribal thing? Was it? I'm going to guess that it mostly was. Now, that doesn't mean that other people wouldn't have been gathered in and everybody who wanted to be there would be there, but it's the same idea. You're going to have family ties because what those things are taught in the home. Those things are taught in the home, and then they're taught generation to generation. And so you're going to build a culture from family and tribe that is going to be carved out typically from the rest of the world.
Yeah. It's funny, as I've been thinking about the practicality of this situation and how to resolve it. It's funny, as all those people are on that land and they could put down their weapons of war. They could love one another and view one another as their brothers and sisters. They could do that. It's possible. I think as I look at it, one of the other things that I hope that members of the church realize is that we have the solution. The solution is Zion, where there is no manner of heights, because we all are one in Christ. If the Palestinians just like wave a magic wand, they all convert to the gospel of Jesus Christ, the restored gospel, and the Jews did the same thing, what would emerge in that land? It would be a miracle. If all of them are going and attending the temple and doing their ministering visits. And I mean, do you realize the power of what we have with the restored gospel? Like, if you want to take the extremes of the situation, like that's why the work that we're doing is so important. The work that we're doing is to transform human hearts so that they don't care about the land. They care about loving the people around them. And I think that maybe this is the answer to the land question. The land all belongs to God. In Zion, all is shared in common. You don't even need the borders. Government is all these government things, all these, borders and all that. It all becomes, it isn't that they get abolished by force by some outside entity that's like, hey, we're going to enforce equity and inclusion. It emerges that the people just like, why do we need police? Like we don't fight with each other. Why do we need a welfare state? We just take care of one another. And all of a sudden these problems, it isn't that it happens overnight in something like everyone joins the church in that, because we even suck as members of the church at living the principles of Zion, but we can get closer to it. And what we've witnessed in the Middle East, in Israel, is about as far from it as you can get. It's absolute hatred for one another to the degree that you are willing to go and murder your brothers and sisters like Cain of old. Like that is the opposite of what we are trying to establish. Like I think light and darkness, when they're put next to each other, you can see things so much clearer. And this weirdly has reinforced my testimony of what we have. We have the greatest thing to take to the world. And there's nothing better that we could do than to go and help people to live the principles of Zion so that things like this don't happen. And that is the power of the gospel, is that it can erode and undermine and subvert the evil forces in this world that cause things like we've witnessed over the last week.
Well, maybe you are the other Ammon that goes to the other side and converts an entire civilization.
Woo! Not me, guys. I'm not that good with a sword, and I am too big of a chicken.
You know, you think about that situation. There's the other thing I was going to bring up when you said, how does this apply to the Latter-day Saints? It is very Book of Mormon, right? It's very Book of Mormon in looking at this. It's, I mean, look at, you see what happens there with the sons of Mosiah, and it's an absolute miracle. I mean, it'd be similar, honestly, on both sides, going to Muslims and going to Jews and having them convert. Mm-hmm. It's almost unthinkable.
Yeah.
Even though, you know, as you say, it's possible. Of course it's possible. And we believe that, at least especially with the Jews, that is eventually something that's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to imagine what has to happen for that to happen.
For sure.
Especially looking at what is happening right now.
Absolutely. Well, I just look at this whole situation and I'm deeply saddened. I think any person with a heart is, because I think from our perspective as Latter-day Saints is the recognition that these people are brothers and sisters, that they're not enemies at the end of the day, and that it is because of, in my estimation, the way I would frame it, sin is the reason that people have these animosities. It's hatred, it's resentment, it's greed, it's pride, it's having identity labels that are higher than child of God, that cause people to do these kind of terrible things. Mm-hmm. And as I think about that, again, it saddens me, but it weirdly fortifies my testimony and my desire to share what we have, because it is the thing that has the ability to transform entire worlds, because Christianity largely did that. And it did bring people together that used to hate one another as they found a new identity in Christ. And Christians obviously have their own issues amongst one another, don't get me wrong. But those who really, truly are converted to Christ no longer have a desire to do harm to their fellow man. I'll give you the last word, Greg.
Well, I agree with that. I think that is the answer. That's always the answer. I don't know how all that's going to happen, and I don't know how close we are to that happening. But I would add one more thing on this. There's one more underlying principle in this conflict and the reaction to it, and that is the idea of liberty and capitalism. And there are those that are always going to fight against that. And this is not a nationalistic thing. This is not even a Western thing. It is, but the reason I'm saying this is because it's a gospel principle, and that is that liberty and freedom are part of the gospel. And that is what the Lord would want, so that we can all express our agency, our moral agency, as best as we can, as we read in section 101 and 109. And that's an additional thing that I would say, as far as morality goes, that is why I would support Israel, is because they do have at least a parliament. They don't have freedom of religion, but they've got a parliamentary democracy, and there is a decent level of liberty there that, to me, in a temporal sense, needs to exist in the world, because without it, Christianity won't exist. And without it, you're removing a major component of the doctrine of Christ. They go hand in hand. Moral agency and its expression is what is tied directly to the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ, because that is where we make our decisions. We can express ourselves more. We can choose right, or we can choose evil, and we can repent, and we can lean on the atoning sacrifice, and we can do that to a much, much higher level in a world of liberty and freedom. And so that to me is another more moral foundation there that makes me want to lean toward Israel and supporting Israel.
Absolutely. And I would say, like I said to everyone, I have a complicated sort of view of it, but at the end of the day, when you boil it down, I do support the existence of the state of Israel, and that they can work out with the Palestinians some sort of a solution that can help, make the violence stop. And I hope that we all can keep the people in those lands in our prayers and pray for peace. So thanks so much, Greg, for
right,
coming on with me. It's been great.
Appreciate it too. Thank you.
So do you enjoy the content here on Thoughtful Faith? If so, be sure to hit the notification bell. This ensures that our new videos show up on your feed. Also, be sure to check out our Facebook group called Thoughtful Saints, where myself and others discuss the sorts of topics found on this channel. And lastly, if you think other people would benefit from this video, please be sure to share it.